The sky above Zora 7 was a cruel shade of indigo, smeared with glacial winds that howled like ancient beasts. Jagged icebergs towered in the distance, and razor-sharp frost licked at the edges of the Galactic Academy's landing zone. The dropship engines hissed and retreated, leaving a group of elite cadets standing on the frozen terrain, their figures small against the colossal ice wall that rose before them. Tall as a city tower, smooth as polished glass, and wickedly vertical. It wasn't just an obstacle, it was a message. The Academy called it the final vertical. For centuries, this exam had served as the last rite of passage for those seeking interstellar survival certification. Cadets from across the galaxy, Silics, Vornax, Threxians, even the ethereal Nualin, had gathered here to prove their worth. But no one had ever scaled the wall without assistance. Gravity disruptors failed. Plasma anchors melted the wrong sections. Organic climbers slipped into the abyss. Every known method had, at some point, failed. Standing quietly among the gathering was a single human cadet, Ava Lynn. Shorter than most of the others, wrapped in a thick earth-forged thermal suit with the Academy crest stitched to the shoulder, she kept to herself, her gloved hands folded behind her back, watching the wall while others exchanged greetings and banter. Her brown eyes studied the patterns of cracks and glimmers in the ice. Her breath fogged the visor of her helmet, but she made no move to clear it. She wasn't interested in the spectacle others made. She was reading the mountain. Species 349 human, an instructor's voice crackled through the comms. Ava Lynn, confirmed for climb. She blinked once and gave a small nod, not to the voice, but to herself. She knew what was expected of her. Humans were often treated as fragile anomalies at the Academy. Creative, yes, but erratic. Many alien instructors doubted that humans would ever master galactic-level survival skills. Too emotional, too primitive, too reliant on instinct and legacy techniques that defied tech-based logic. Climb must be completed within 48 hours, the instructor continued. You may use any available natural resources. No external assistance. Any cadet who falls or retreats is automatically disqualified. The other cadets were already gearing up. Zorak, a towering Threxian with semi-liquid limbs, activated his suction pads with a hiss and clanked toward the base. Next to him, the Nualan cadet, sheathed in bioluminescent armor, extended her energy tendrils, probing the wall for weaknesses. Everyone had a plan. Everyone had the finest tech their species could engineer. Ava didn't move. Not yet. She listened to the others speak through open comms, analyzing strategy. Some were confident. Others already sounded frustrated. The first attempts began. Zorak pressed his limbs to the wall, clinging with his gelatinous mass, but within 10 meters, a gust of icy wind swept one of his anchor points loose. He crashed down into the snow, snarling. The Nualin shimmered up 30 meters before her energy field began to crackle erratically, overloaded by the wall's natural magnetic interference. She descended, trembling and pale, her armor dim. Another cadet, a rigidly logical Hexari from the ice planet Rythan, tried to use thermal blasts to melt handholds, but the wall responded like a living creature, refreezing too quickly, creating slick patches that destabilized him. His legs slipped out from under him, and he barely activated his anti-grav field in time to avoid crashing. Hours passed. The sun on Zora 7 barely moved, casting an eerie twilight across the barren plains. The instructors observed silently from their station dome, logging data, marking failures. Of the 17 cadets, none had gone past the 40-meter mark. Most were already nursing bruises or retreating to their tents to replan. Some argued about strategy. Others quietly packed up, admitting silent defeat. Ava remained standing, still not moving toward the wall. She studied how each failed attempt changed the surface. New cracks, small refreezing ridges, pockets of mist. She wasn't looking for weaknesses. She was watching how the wall breathed. One of the alien cadets, a Vornak with 4 glassy eyes, turned to her and scoffed, Why do you just stare at it, human? You afraid? Or just waiting to see what we get wrong before you copy it?" She didn't reply. She barely even looked at him. What she was waiting for had nothing to do with them. When night came, the winds howled louder, as if warning them that the wall did not sleep. Most cadets retreated into their insulated tents or dug shallow shelters into the snowbanks. Ava walked calmly across the frozen plain, away from the main camp, toward a darker region of the glacier where the ground dipped slightly. She scanned the surface, tapped it with her boot, then dropped to one knee and began digging with a gloved hand. Within moments, she hit solid rock, volcanic stone, porous and black, exactly what she hoped to find. She pulled a compact bag from her satchel and began extracting supplies: coiled titanium wire, a roll of insulated foil, a dented cooking pot, and a fire gel capsule. While others tried to break the wall with advanced engineering, Ava was building something else entirely. She was laying stones in a circle, forming a crude furnace, shielding it with ice blocks to prevent wind interference. Once the gel ignited, flames crackled and licked at the pot she placed above. She scooped snow into the pot and watched it melt. Behind her, the auroras of Zora 7 shimmered in silence. No one approached. No one asked what she was doing. Her comms were off, her helmet unlit. But the instructors watched through thermal lenses, puzzled. Ava took a small notebook from her sleeve and scribbled notes with a graphite pen. She wasn't planning to defeat the wall with gadgets. She was going to understand it, and then work with it. By morning, the first batches of boiling water were ready. She poured them into reinforced canisters and strapped them to her sides. Her climbing hooks, fashioned from bent alloy rods, were sharpened using the hot stones from her furnace, then cooled in snow. The handles were wrapped in synthetic leather stripped from her boot's inner lining. It was crude. It was ugly. But it would work. As the sun peeked over the jagged horizon, Ava stood up, wiped a layer of frost from her faceplate, and finally walked toward the wall. She said nothing. She didn't ask for luck. She just stared at the impossible and whispered, too softly for anyone to hear, "You're just frozen water. Let's dance." And then she began her climb. Ava reached the base of the ice wall just after first light, her silhouette a dark shape against the glowing blue expanse of the vertical glacier. Wind swept over the plateau, dragging with it a fine mist of powdered ice that shimmered in the dim sunlight. She set down her gear with precise movements, avoiding unnecessary motion, as if every gesture had been mentally rehearsed. Her breath escaped in slow, controlled clouds. Her eyes scanned the surface again, not as an enemy to conquer, but as a living thing to read. From a distance, other cadets observed her movements with thinly veiled curiosity. Some had gathered around portable thermal units, licking the wounds of failure and discussing theoretical tactics. Others were still tending to their equipment or staring at the wall in bitter silence. Among them, Zorak stood with arms crossed, his wide shoulders hunched forward. His earlier failure still sat in his posture like frost on steel. He watched Ava with narrowed, skeptical eyes as she unpacked strange, improvised tools from her pack. She unrolled a thin, reflective thermal blanket and spread it across the snow, placing her climbing tools neatly on top. 2 hooked claws made from salvaged equipment. A small, compact container with a reinforced nozzle, her first boiling water canister. Several strips of insulation cut from her own tent lining, and a belt lined with small pouches, each filled with differently shaped shards of sharpened metal she had spent the night carving by firelight. No technology glowed. No AI assistants blinked to life. Nothing about her setup resembled the sleek, alien-grade equipment the other cadets relied on. To them, her gear looked ancient, primitive, even foolish. The Nualan cadet, still recovering from the failure of her energy field, tilted her glowing visor toward Ava. "She's building a campfire kit?" the Nualan muttered over private comms, her voice tinged with disbelief. "Is she climbing the wall or making tea at the summit?" Zorak grunted. "She's stalling. When the time limit comes, She'll claim she was observing. Humans overthink, then they break. But Ava wasn't stalling. She moved deliberately, layering fabric over her hands and forearms, testing the grip strength of her hooks against her gloves, measuring how far each spike extended past her knuckles. She picked up one claw and jabbed it into the snow with force, noting how it buried into the ice and how much resistance she felt. She took out a smaller shard, shaped like a flat arrowhead, and slipped it into a slot on her glove's backplate. A soft click confirmed the attachment. Then she tried a different shape, this one with serrated edges, and repeated the process. Her tools weren't interchangeable just for convenience. She was tailoring them to respond to the wall's conditions in real time. When she had tested each combination, she moved to her canister and knelt beside it. Steam hissed from the vent as she carefully unlatched the seal and dipped a metallic ladle into the boiling water. She poured a tiny stream over a patch of nearby ice, not on the wall, but on a sloped surface nearby. The ice hissed and cracked. Water trickled, then instantly refroze. She waited, counted seconds, then poured another thin stream. Again she waited. This time the water sank slightly into the surface before freezing, creating a shallow recess. Ava reached for a claw and jammed it into the softened patch. It held. Not long, not deep, but just enough. Her mouth curled slightly under the helmet's seal. She stood, adjusted the strap on her chest harness, and grabbed a second canister. She didn't carry them on her back. That would have disrupted balance. Instead, she hooked them to her sides, like weighted wings, one on each hip. This distribution allowed her to reach them easily, to control the direction of the pour, and to shift her weight mid-climb. As she stepped closer to the wall itself, the ice pulsed with reflected sunlight. The glacier wasn't smooth. It had micro-contours, ridges, and narrow vertical fissures. Most cadets ignored them, trying to overpower the surface with brute force or tech. Ava pressed her palm against one fissure. Her fingers slipped inward ever so slightly, and a thin, cold drip ran down her wrist. It was alive, not sentient, but reactive. The glacier responded to heat, to pressure, to sound. It screamed when scorched. It hardened when pierced. It wanted to push back. So she would move quietly. She raised her canister and poured a slow stream of boiling water into the narrow fissure. The steam rose immediately, cloaking her glove in fog. Then she pulled back, waited, and jabbed her left claw into the same spot. The metal edge slipped in deeper than expected. She twisted it gently, and it held. The first hold was made. From across the field, instructors in the observation dome leaned forward. One of them, an insectoid strategist from the Larathi cluster, tapped her claw on the glass and muttered something unreadable. The analyst next to her began documenting Ava's actions in a separate log. Back on the ground, Ava was already preparing her next move. She selected a different spike. This one curved slightly inward like the talon of a raptor. She aligned it with a thin vertical fracture a meter above the first hold. She repeated the same method, boiling, waiting, striking. Another hold. Then she moved to the next, and the next. Like a sculptor coaxing shape from stone, she wasn't forcing her path upward. She was creating it one calculated move at a time. By the time she reached 5 meters, the wall below her resembled a thin diagonal trail of melted scars and metal slashes. Each hold was imperfect, barely wide enough for her gloved fingers or the edge of a boot. But she wasn't interested in comfort. She needed just enough to hang. She paused and looked down, not to check for praise, not for fear, but to memorize her fallback path. If something failed, she would need to descend without delay. She mapped each foothold mentally, calculating which ones she could reuse and which would collapse if her weight shifted too far. Then she reached into one of her side pouches and pulled out a small packet, compressed resin, harvested from a Terran pine tree. She crushed it between her palms, letting the sticky substance smear across her gloves. With the added friction, her grip stabilized. She climbed another meter. Cadets in the camp began to notice. One by one, faces turned. Silence rippled through their ranks. Zorak scoffed again, but this time it was half-hearted. The Newlin blinked slowly, her tendrils dimming in the ambient light. "She's using boiling water?" one cadet asked aloud. "And metal claws," another added. "No drones, no AI. She's climbing the old way." Still, Ava didn't speak. Her comms remained off. Her world had narrowed to the crack of ice under her hooks, the hiss of water hitting frozen stone, and the slow, disciplined motion of her legs pushing her upward. At 10 meters, her left hook slipped. She reacted instantly, pivoting her torso and wedging her foot into a nearby notch. Her boot held, her right arm locked. She hung suspended for a breathless second, then calmly drove a serrated spike into a fresh fracture and resumed her climb. The instructors marked the moment as a test of composure. No flinch, no panic, just correction. By midday, Ava had reached 20 meters. She anchored herself to a deep crevice and took her first break, not to rest, but to refill a canister using her insulated water pouch. The others below could only watch. For them, the wall had been a confrontation. For her, it was a conversation, and she was speaking fluently. By the time Ava reached 30 meters, the ice wall had stopped being a structure. It had become an opponent. The terrain shifted in nature as she ascended, growing less fractured and more polished, as though the higher layers had been forged under greater pressure and time. The footholds she had created lower down no longer formed as easily. The water cooled faster, sometimes freezing mid-pour before it even touched the surface. Her spikes, though honed and reliable, began to bend slightly from repeated impact. The cold bit through every layer she wore, and her fingers, even through the gloves, began to lose feeling at the tips. But she climbed. Not in long, dramatic strides, nor with theatrical flourishes, but with patient, stubborn rhythm. Every meter was a negotiation. She moved like a creature evolved for cold, not born into it. Her pace slowed, but her movements grew more precise. Each new hold was formed after longer deliberation. She tapped the surface with the tips of her claws before choosing where to place a droplet of boiling water. She listened to the sound of the ice cracking. If it splintered too sharply, she knew it would collapse. If it made no sound at all, it was too dense to soften. Somewhere above her, the light fractured into fine particles of gold and blue as the sun shifted behind a mist bank. The wall reflected a spectrum that turned her silhouette into a glowing outline, as though the ice had accepted her presence and painted her into its surface. She stopped at 35 meters, not out of exhaustion, but to adjust her tools. Her left claw had begun to wobble at the joint. She carefully unstrapped it with one hand while balancing her full body weight on her right hook and foothold. The maneuver was slow, tense, but necessary. She retrieved a replacement joint from her pouch, a piece she had carved using spare harness clamps. Her breath, short and frosted, steamed against her visor as she fastened the part into place. The click it made was muted, but it held. She reached for the canister on her right hip. It was nearly empty. She tilted it slowly and caught the final few milliliters of boiling water, which by now had lost much of its heat. She poured it onto a narrow horizontal ridge, then jabbed her spike into it before the liquid had a chance to refreeze. Her boot found the next ledge with a soft crunch, and she pushed herself up. From the observation dome, instructors had stopped logging data into the standard system and began recording her climb in a separate report, one that would be reviewed by command. Not because she had broken a record, not because she had outperformed in speed or style, but because she was applying a method the Academy had never documented in the modern age. Primitive wasn't supposed to work on Zora 7, yet there she was. The wind shifted again. The upper drafts struck harder, curling around the curvature of the ice wall like a serpent. It howled past Ava's ears and tugged at her harness. She turned her face slightly toward the gust, narrowing her eyes behind the visor. She dug her claws deeper and pressed her body flat against the wall. When the wind tried to rip her loose, it found no leverage. Once it passed, she resumed without pause. At 40 meters, she encountered a real problem. A wide sheet of the wall, at least 6 meters across, had been polished smooth by years of glacial movement and wind erosion. No fissures, no ridges, just an uninterrupted curtain of blue and white ice that stretched above and to the sides like a sealed gate. She paused, breathing steadily, heart thumping. She looked up. The edge of the sheet curved inward slightly, forming an overhang, a trap for the careless. Climbing over it would mean hanging entirely by her arms for at least 2 meters, with no opportunity to rest her legs. She checked her remaining gear. 1 nearly full canister. 3 backup spikes. Her second claw was still functional but growing dull. She examined the base of the smooth sheet, then knelt slightly and chipped away at the outer layer with the edge of a claw, creating a thin cavity like a ledge. It was shallow, barely enough to fit her boot, but enough to act as a launch point. She jammed 1 claw into the last solid hold she had created and wedged her left foot into the new micro-ledge. Her arms tensed. She took 1 deep breath. Then she leaped. It wasn't graceful. Her shoulder slammed into the wall. Her claw scraped before catching. Her right leg dangled. She scrambled, finding the edge of the overhang with her left hook and locking it into a crevice she hadn't seen from below. Her breathing was sharp now, but not panicked. She pulled herself up and over, ignoring the burning in her shoulders, the growing numbness in her hands, and the deep, dull ache in her calves. When she reached the lip of the smooth section, she rested her chin briefly against the ice. Not to relax, but to confirm stability. She exhaled, watching the frost on her visor shift with her breath, then continued upward. Each movement became heavier after that. Her muscles responded slower, and she had to rely more on technique than strength. She began alternating sides more carefully, resting 1 arm while working the other. She used her weight to test every hold before committing. The wind howled again, and she anchored herself instantly. The sound wasn't intimidating anymore. It had become a signal, a part of the rhythm. At 50 meters, something unexpected happened. A deep vibration pulsed through the wall. Not an earthquake, not a collapse, but a groan, subtle and internal, as though the glacier itself was warning her. She froze, gripping tightly to her holds, and waited. The vibration faded. She understood then. The upper wall was hollow in sections. Pockets of air, formed by heat or movement, lay hidden beneath. She had to move differently now, softer. She couldn't trust what looked stable. She needed to feel it first. Her hands trembled from fatigue, but she adjusted her grip. She began using the spikes less and her fingertips more, brushing the ice, listening for the pitch, sensing the density through vibration. Every time she found a patch that felt solid, she repeated the boil and stab process. She made no missteps. By the time she passed the 60-meter mark, the cadets below had gone completely silent. No one joked anymore. No one doubted. Some watched with a strange mixture of awe and discomfort. Others refused to speak at all, unable to explain what they were seeing. Ava didn't resemble the cadet most of them had dismissed as underpowered or outdated. She resembled something far older, a shadow of ancient survival, before tech, before gravity lifts, before AI companions. She resembled someone who had learned to suffer with purpose. She paused again, perched like an Arctic hawk on a narrow ridge. She drank a few drops of lukewarm water from her pouch, conserving the rest. She removed 1 glove and massaged her palm, grimacing at how stiff her fingers had become. Her knuckles were red and raw, but she flexed them and slid the glove back on. She still had more climb ahead. She looked up. The wall extended for another 40 meters. The final ascent would be vertical with no breaks. But she had studied the shape. She had mapped it in her mind. She could see the path now, hidden to everyone else but clear in her vision. A line of approach that curved slightly to the left, where ice layers overlapped imperfectly, creating faint shelves only she had noticed. She tightened her belt. She checked her claws. Then she took 1 last breath and resumed the climb, fading slowly upward into the mist, like a myth returning to the mountain that made her. At 70 meters, the air felt different, thinner, sharper. The wind no longer howled in bursts. It screeched in high, constant waves that sliced through fabric and clawed at exposed skin like invisible talons. The sky above Ava had dimmed to a cold, slate gray, and the mist that hovered above the wall had thickened into a veil. She had entered a different world, one suspended between atmosphere and ice, where sound carried strangely and time moved like freezing syrup. Her face was pale now, her lips slightly cracked despite the sealed interior of her helmet. Sweat soaked the inner lining of her thermal suit, then froze against her skin. She no longer glanced down. Every instinct told her that below meant failure, danger, collapse. She wasn't afraid of falling. She was afraid of wasting the effort it had taken to reach this point. Her fingers had grown clumsy, the fine motor control fading. Twice, she fumbled a spike, nearly dropping it into the abyss. She tied one to her wrist with a length of insulated string to prevent another loss. Her water was nearly gone. Her left leg had begun to spasm every 15 steps. And still, she climbed. She climbed as the wind roared. She climbed as her breath rasped. She climbed while the cadets below, clustered at the base of the wall, watched her as if watching something sacred or cursed. The Nualan cadet, whose tendrils now flickered with a dim violet glow, paced in a small circle. Her armor had gone dim, her previous confidence faded into silence. She kept checking her visor, switching between infrared and optical, tracking Ava's position. When she saw the figure pause at a jagged protrusion nearly 80 meters above the ground, she froze. "She's still going," she whispered, more to herself than anyone else. Zorak, arms crossed, glared at the wall. He refused to acknowledge his growing discomfort. "She's reckless," he muttered. "That wall changes near the top. If she hits the crystal edge..." "She'll adapt," said another voice quietly. A lean, amphibious cadet from the Freyland species had remained silent most of the exam. He now stood with eyes narrowed, scanning the wall. "She's not climbing. She's reading." In the observation dome, the lead instructor stepped back from the console. The drone footage revealed Ava as a small figure swaying in the wind, partially obscured by a sheet of blowing frost. Her hands moved with agonizing slowness, but each movement was deliberate. She pressed her forehead to the ice once, lingered, then moved again. "She's begun the traverse," the instructor said flatly. The assistant, a young trainee from another sector, looked confused. "Traverse?" "The last stretch. The vertical becomes concave. It curves outward. It's like climbing the underside of a ledge." "But how can she—" "She shouldn't be able to," the instructor interrupted. "Not with that equipment, not with that body mass, and not after 70 meters of climb." But Ava was not concerned with what she should or should not be able to do. Her fingers burned now, not from heat, but from the strange, disorienting numbness that came before nerve shutdown. She flexed them constantly. She tapped her gloves against the ice to keep blood circulating. Her right knee was stiff, and she had begun compensating by putting more pressure on her left arm. Her left arm had started to shake. She stopped below the overhang, panting into her helmet. The sound echoed inside like a drum beat. She closed her eyes for a moment, not to rest, but to imagine her path forward. The wall above her jutted out slightly. She would have to lean back, hang her weight from her arms, and find purchase with her hooks on the inverted face. There were no cracks, only the tiniest of shadows. She reached for her final canister. Just a few sips of warmth left. She uncapped it, leaned to the side, and drizzled the boiling water upward onto the underside of the overhang. It splashed, scattered, hissed. She had to wait. 30 seconds. 45. Then she took her right claw and drove it upward into the still damp patch. It struck, sank, held. She exhaled, tightened her grip, and began pulling herself around the ledge. Her body arched, her feet dangled, her arms screamed in protest. She bit down on the inside of her cheek to stay focused. A drop of blood slid down her throat. Her left hand moved next, finding a notch. She pulled again. Her back was fully parallel to the ground below. The void beneath her yawned open like a mouth. In that moment, the wind shrieked with a new force. A full-blown storm had arrived. At the base camp, cadets ducked behind windshields. Supplies scattered across the snow. Communication feeds stuttered. The observation dome flickered as its external sensors overloaded. "She's still on the wall," shouted one of the cadets. "Someone should call for emergency evac," said another. "Her comms are off. No signal," the assistant instructor said. "She'll fall," Zorak muttered. "No one can hold through that." But Ava did not fall. She anchored her left foot into a narrow seam and arched her back. Her entire body trembled. She forced her hips upward, transitioning into a crouch against the overhang. She pressed her helmet against the ice to distribute weight. The storm tore at her pack, but she had tied everything down. Her eyes watered. The wind howled. The ice cracked once beneath her boot, but she shifted her stance, realigning her center of gravity. In that howl, there was no sound from her, no scream, no radio, no breath that escaped into the storm. Just motion. She reached up again. Another hook landed, another hold, another breath. The storm lasted 13 minutes. When the worst passed, Ava was 30 meters higher, past the overhang, clinging to a sheer face where the wall glittered like shattered glass. Inside the observation dome, silence dominated. The lead instructor turned to the assistant. "Get the high-resolution recorders. This will be archived, not for analysis, for history." One of the older cadets stepped toward the dome window, watching as Ava's shape began to fade into the rising mist. "Why isn't she stopping?" he asked. The amphibious cadet, eyes still fixed on the wall, answered softly, "Because she's not climbing to pass. She's climbing to understand." At 85 meters, Ava stopped at a small ridge. Her hands no longer trembled because she couldn't feel them. Her muscles had stopped aching because they had numbed. She had passed the point of discomfort, the point of logic. She now moved by will alone. A system of commands from her mind to her body, transmitted through frozen nerves, bypassing pain, fear, and exhaustion. She looked upward. The summit was near, maybe 15 meters more. But the ice had changed again, glowing, translucent, almost brittle in appearance. She would need to use finesse now. No more hammering, no more stabbing. She tied her claws to her waist. She removed a small flat shard from her pouch, a smooth-edged spike she had saved from the first night. She held it between her thumb and forefinger, then pressed it gently into the softest portion of the ice. It sank slowly, almost as if the wall invited it. Then she pulled herself up with both hands, pressing her chest and thighs to the surface, dragging herself upward in a slow, animal motion. Her breath was ragged now. Her vision dimmed at the edges. A small crack formed beneath her left hand. She stopped, waited, shifted, then moved again. 10 meters, 7, 5. At 3 meters below the summit, she reached the final vertical span. One more claw, one more pull. Her fingers slipped. For the first time in the climb, she slid. Her right foot kicked out, scraped, found nothing. She dropped 15 centimeters before her left hook caught the edge of a fissure. She dangled in silence. Below her, the wall stretched down into whiteness. Above her, the summit was so close she could almost touch it. Her heart hammered once, twice. Then she reached up, drove her right hook into the crack again, and pulled herself over the last edge. No scream, no celebration, just the sound of her body collapsing onto the frost-blown summit, face first into the snow, chest heaving, breath fogging the ice beneath her cheek. She didn't speak. She didn't move. But a flare shot into the air from her belt, a small orange streak that arced over the glacier and burst into the sky above Zora 7. Back at the base, cadets and instructors alike saw the glow. The silence broke. But Ava, lying on the summit, said nothing at all. She had finished her conversation with the wall, and the wall, in its own silent way, had listened. The flare's orange glow faded into the pale sky, leaving behind a moment of breathless stillness. Ava remained where she had collapsed, her cheek pressed against the frozen summit. Her chest rose and fell in short, shallow motions as her lungs strained to recover. Her limbs no longer obeyed instinct. They obeyed only command. She closed her eyes for a few seconds, letting the wind pass over her like a final trial, and then pushed herself up slowly, bracing her palms against the icy ground beneath her. Every movement required negotiation with pain. Her knees trembled as she stood, her spine curling slightly forward. Her arms hung at her sides, stiff and heavy like they no longer belonged to her. But she stood, alone, at the top of the highest training wall the Galactic Academy had ever engineered. The summit stretched wide, an uneven plateau carved by centuries of wind and ice. In the center stood a simple metal marker, dull gray and half-frozen, embedded in the ground, a relic from the Academy's first architects. It had no ornamentation, no beacon, no glowing praise. Just a number, 100.00 meters. She took one step toward it, then another. Her boots crunched against the snow in slow, deliberate rhythm. Each footprint left behind a faint, melting imprint that hardened seconds later into permanent record. She reached the marker and placed her hand upon it, letting her fingers rest against the cold metal. She said nothing. There was nothing left to say. A soft chime crackled in her helmet, an emergency signal override. Her communications feed came alive for the first time in hours. "Cadet Ava Lynn," the voice said, male, formal, clipped. "Confirming your position at summit marker. Your time has been logged. Extraction drone en route. Estimated arrival, 5 minutes. She tapped a button on her wrist plate. "Confirmed." Static followed, then silence again. Far below, the cadets stood in stunned quiet. The wind had calmed. The storm had passed. The ice wall loomed over them like a monument to failure, for most, but also to revelation. The lead instructor remained in the dome, eyes locked on the summit feed, arms folded, expression unreadable. Her assistant reviewed the footage again and again, searching for the moment where technology should have prevailed and didn't. The cadets themselves didn't speak much. What could they say? The climb had not been elegant. It had not been efficient by alien standards. But it had been absolute. And now, it had rewritten the rules of survival for the Academy. On the summit, Ava turned from the marker and walked toward the edge where the glacier gave way to open sky. She stood there, looking out, not down, her gaze fixed on the endless plains of Zora 7, stretching to a horizon barely visible through drifting mist. The extraction drone approached from the east, its shadow crawling over the ice. It landed 15 meters away, skids sinking slightly into the frost. The side panel opened, revealing a warm-lit cabin and a stasis bench prepped for medical recovery. She took one last breath of the high-altitude air, let it fill her chest, and then turned her back on the wall. As she stepped inside the drone, her knees buckled slightly. She gripped the frame for support and pulled herself in. The door sealed behind her. She lay down on the bench without protest, eyes fluttering closed as the warming gel activated beneath her. Her body began the slow process of thawing and healing. Her mind drifted. When she woke again, it was inside the Academy infirmary, under soft lighting and layers of thermal recovery fabric. A gentle hum filled the room, the sound of atmospheric balancers and healing stimulators working in tandem. She felt her fingers again, though faintly. Her throat was dry, her vision blurred. But her heartbeat was steady. Her legs were sore but intact. A nurse drone hovered above her, scanned her vitals, then transmitted the data silently to the monitoring console nearby. No one else spoke for several minutes. Then the door opened. The lead instructor entered, a tall woman of rigid bearing, with silver markings across her brow denoting seniority and command status. She stood at the foot of Ava's bed and did not speak right away. She studied her cadet for a long moment, then took a seat beside her without ceremony. "You know," she began slowly, In 200 years of operating this facility, I've seen over 400 cadets attempt that wall. I've seen 22 reach the halfway point. I've seen 4 pass the 70-meter line. But I've never seen one reach the summit without powered equipment. Ava blinked. Her lips parted, voice hoarse. I didn't climb it for records. I know. The instructor leaned back. That's why it worked. She tapped her data pad once and pulled up a screen. You'll receive full points for the exam. But more than that, the method you used has triggered a review by the Survival Doctrine Committee. There will be studies, field integration trials, simulations based on your choices, and your field logs have already been copied into the Academy archives under special designation. Ava shifted her head slightly on the pillow. What designation? The instructor hesitated for a second. Adaptive Human Tactics, Unconventional Survival Series, Class 1. Ava closed her eyes again, a faint line forming at the corner of her mouth. It wasn't quite a smile, but something close. I wasn't trying to teach anyone anything. No, the instructor said. You were doing what humans do, making sense of impossible things. With clawed gloves and boiling water. She stood again, nodding toward the door. Rest now. You'll be debriefed in the morning. But know this. From this point forward, every cadet who looks at that wall will think differently. The door slid shut behind her. 2 weeks later, during the next rotation of survival exams, a Threxian cadet approached the base of the wall. He carried a standard climbing kit, calibrated to his species. But tucked inside his side pouch, almost absurdly small for his size, was a dented cooking pot and a sealed thermal flask labeled "Boil First." He said nothing about it, but he looked up at the ice with different eyes. And far away, back on Earth, in a modest storage room beneath the Academy's Human Heritage Wing, a new plaque was mounted beside a replica of Ava's gear. It read, "She didn't break the wall. She taught it how to let someone through." And no one ever looked at the final vertical the same way again.